Welcome to the Equipping Leaders Podcast Leader Study Series. I'm Natasha, a leader development professional and overall leadership enthusiast.
And I'm Corey, a program manager and emerging people leader, and thus a leadership enthusiast.
We are doing a leader study of the TV show Z Nation, deconstructing the leaders, leadership decisions, and team dynamics of the characters on the show, to look at how leadership is all around us. And even if we're not in a position of leadership, we can still demonstrate it in our actions, responses, and in the opportunities around us.
Z Nation aired from 2014 to 2018, but if you haven't seen it yet, there will be spoilers in these episodes. In this episode, we're talking about Season 1, Episode 7, Welcome to the Foo Bar, and Episode 8, Zunami. Let's jump in.
Okay, so Garnett has passed and the team is trying to figure out how to move forward. So we are in Season 1, Episode 7, Welcome to the Foo Bar. And there's a lot of feelings going on, but also still a lot of hope and forward momentum. So what stood out to you?
So Warren at this point is pretty much like shut down and the team is self-managing, right? So again, easy because in this instance, the overall, like the big task for the group is still move west to California, right? So in these moments of her being somewhat shut down, the team can still like somewhat effectively move forward. And then they're all kind of going through their own coping mechanisms. So I think Murphy's trying to engage with Warren a little bit, right? As like you'd said previously, I think in some of the earlier episodes, he's slowly trying to like show that he can be a part of this team. So he's reaching out to her on kind of a point to point. And then I also think it was interesting that Citizen Z sort of had that little like death ceremony funeral. That's what death ceremonies are called, by the way. That sort of little funeral thing where he's like, hey, salute you for all the things you did. So like he's coped, right? He addressed the issue and he's moving on. And I think it's interesting that Warren is still sort of struggling and the rest of the team is like, hey, we know we have to help her. But I think there's also kind of that little bit of concern about like, do we still believe in this mission now that Garnett's gone? Is Warren going to be able to sort of do this alone? And Mac and Addie, they sort of like take off on their own little thing, right? And they're like, hey, we gave it the best shot. Let's go. So I think that's pretty interesting.
So yes. So Warren is going through it. Murphy does something really great there too, where he is not the best at approaching people, but he brings up the really great point to her that they're not going to follow anybody else but her.
Yeah.
And so that she needs to kind of get her stuff together. But she is shut down, right? We all have things happen to us that shut us down, and they're still bringing her along with the team. So yeah, I thought that that was a kind of a really cool point for Murphy too, where you could see that like Murphy's also starting to really lean into this mission as well. And then yeah, Addie and Mac, they go ahead to do the recon to see if they can find the fuel because the truck breaks down. And what I thought was really interesting about that is when they leave the group, and so now it's like the whole group is back in storming, and they're storming around whether Roberta Warren is the leader who can take them forward, because right now she's not showing that, nor should she be expected to. She's not a robot. But yeah, whether it's Murphy trying to engage with her on that, or Addie and Mac when he says, what if she doesn't recover? But I think Addie brings up this really great point too, where she says we have to go back because we all stand for each other. And I think that ultimately, like, that's that piece of this, like, when those transactional relationships do kind of start to become more emotional and more relational, where it's like now it's this bigger thing where, yes, we need to get Murphy to California, we need to get this mission or this vision accomplished, but at the same time, we know each other, we trust each other, we know how to get through all these different things, so we stand for each other.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point too, because then it's not right. Like in this instance, it was the death of like the current group leader, but I also think that as leaders, some days you're just not on your A game, you're not like feeling it, and that's okay. and because people on the team sometimes aren't going to be feeling it, and that's okay too. So I think the fact that the team was like, able to continue to work and acknowledge that, and also, right, she maybe wasn't there all the way as they needed her to be, but they were at least self-sufficient enough to kind of keep going. And I think sometimes, you get that pressure of the leadership role, like you always have to be ready to go and always have that smile on your face and always be, like spouting off like these great, like profound, like these Steve Jobs sort of moments and comments and making these great decisions. And that's not always necessary or expected. And I think it's also having the faith in your team to be able to keep working like that, and their emotional intelligence to realize maybe they're not in the best, that this leader isn't in the best mindset, and maybe it's not the best time to raise some of these problems because it's not going to, they're not going to come at it with the right sort of attitude towards it. So that distance sometimes can be very important as well.
Mhm. And we also saw, again, Doc, just with the way that he does his own leadership and supports other team members when 10K wants to drive. And we learned that 10K has not ever been taught how to drive. But Doc isn't like, I'll do it, let somebody else do it. He's just like, he asks, who taught you how to drive? 10K says nobody. And he's like, well, hands on 10 and 2, easy on the gas, right? Like, it's like, that just, okay, we're just going to keep moving forward with this. You said you wanted to do this. Let's let you do it, see how you do with it. And not freaking out or trying to put all these rules and parameters on someone. So I thought that was just a really interesting thing that popped up too.
That's such a good, I forgot about that in this episode. It's such a good point too, because there were no immediate do outs, right? There was no immediate risk from zombies. There were no chains in the plan. So it was kind of like this lull point. And what a great time to do, like, we often call it left seat, right seat. And in this case, it was literally left seat, right seat of driving. So, hey, we have this moment. We know what that big goal is. There's nothing coming down, right? The tasking pipeline, as far as like these immediate do outs, there's no big threats. Yeah, great time to get a new skill added to the team. And that, yeah, you're right. That's like it was such a great use of time and such a great little like leadership thing. And then as they approach the town, it's like Slappy and Sleazy, but what's their name? Sleazy and
Skeezy.
Skeezy, excuse me, yes. When they come up on them in that little town and there's that whole shooting contest, right? I think it's cool because that gives 10K another opportunity to shine, and like he's got that skill for like being a sharpshooter or a marksman or whatever. And so, Doc's super supportive of that and is like, hey, we need the resources that they have, and really stands behind him and is like, he's the best that we got. And I think that's really cool too, that sort of support that he's showing. Even though, cut to a few hours ago in the show, theoretically, he was showing he's very weak on something that was sort of like what you and I would consider a basic skill like driving. So I think that's cool that Doc was able to sort of compartmentalize and like, everyone has strengths, everyone has weaknesses. Just because you have a weakness somewhere else doesn't mean I'm still not going to highlight your strength. And I thought that was pretty neat.
Yes. Yeah, the people don't have to be good at all the same things we're good at to be considered valuable. That's obviously what makes them valuable, is what they bring to the table. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that was cool. And then still you have like Warren is still not in like that great like mental state yet. So you have the team sort of autonomously trying to make the best decisions based off of sort of the last guidance that they were given of, make it west, stay alive, those sort of generic drivers that they have. And they were able to self-identify needing a new vehicle, and everything else. So it's like they're moving without her because at least the guidance given up front was clear, concise, and everyone had buy-in to that. So I think that's pretty a really great reflection too of sort of like you were talking about. They're storming again a little bit, but there was some norming that had happened before. So at this point, it's a little bit of context switching. So a little bit of loss in like as far as like capacity goes, and what do you want, like as far as their productivity and effectiveness goes, right? There's definitely been a drop there, but there was still enough of a relationship built prior to that sort of switch there that they can continue on.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's as Warren is working through her stuff, it's really interesting because I mean, we all know the stages of grief. That's not really what this is about, but there is this piece of like, sometimes we have to work through it and it doesn't make sense to other people. So like if we go back a little bit, like the Home Sweet Zombie episode where she goes back to that place where it's like she had this thing that she needed to face. And sometimes, so there are these challenges that we have to face. And then on the other token, there's challenges that we have to move through. And this is more of a move through one. And again, sometimes you don't know what to say. And as the leader, there's this expectation that you know the right things to say all the time. And so I thought that was also a really powerful piece of let the leader be absorbed as a team member for a while and not have to be the leader while they, figure out what that is. And she did it very skillfully too, right? As all great leaders do, where it's like, yeah, like for her, it was like, let me kind of like drink this away. But also then when she got to say out loud to that zombie, like all the things that she wanted to say, all the reasons why she was so mad and hurt by what happened. But I think that like that is just such a great indication of like this leader self-care that leaders don't always do, right? Like I always say, I think everybody should have a therapist and a coach, because those are the part of your support system that provide the space for you to do those things. Because trying to explain that if you're trying to explain to somebody that you're mad at this person because they gave you hope and and then they died, it can feel like, when you say it like that, it can feel so weird, right? Or it can feel petty, and it's like, but it's not. These are these like really big emotions that we really have to work through. So I thought that was just really kind of interesting how she played that out for herself and really like let it out of her system. Because I think another thing too that great leaders realize is that you have to let it out, right? There's more space out than in. So don't like keep it in there. You can't put it on the people that you lead. That's wildly toxic and inappropriate, but you do have to get it out. And so when people can do that well and understand that they need to do that and not suppress it, I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Because the other thing too that I thought was kind of interesting when you're talking about like the team overall, right? And like when Murphy runs into that situation when he's trying to steal the car keys from that like random rich guy in the apocalypse, right? That with that arrogance and everything that he had, and then I think he like sort of passed out or whatever, right? When he went behind the barn there to go visit nature, right? Because it was calling, as it were. I think he the guy came back awake after he got the keys and saw the bite marks on Murphy and was like, "Are you a zombie?" Murphy's starting to look a little bit more haggard now too. And I think like when it comes down to within the context of the show, the group that he's with, right, they accept him, understand his situation and his plight, and don't have to ask the questions anymore. That is not the case with those around him either. And I think like maybe he's starting to realize that the world is not like a safe place for him outside of that team. So a lot of the things that seem like over paternal or overprotective, or as if he's being condescended to, that's because I don't think he had realized how different he'd started to look or how different he was to the group that he was around. And that like some of his actions and mannerisms and now physical characteristics weren't going to be as like accepted by this like post-apocalyptic society. And I thought that was like super interesting as well, because that's a burden now that I would think he would start to understand that Warren and the rest of the team are going through whenever they're interacting with these new people. You already have this issue of it being lawless, apocalyptic, and now you also have like this external driver and motivated of like people aren't always nice to people who don't look like them, and like that group is feeling that burden. And I thought that was like pretty interesting as well.
It's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. And it makes a lot of sense too, because there's a point where Murphy bites someone and Doc asks them if he bit someone and Murphy denies it. So it's this whole piece of like, I don't want to be rejected by my group. And I know that was something that I should not have done. But I need this social group, whether it's he needs them to get him to California for protection or whatever. But like, as humans, our need and our drive to belong and be a part of a social group is super, super important. And so he would lie, he'd do anything to stay a part of it now.
Yeah, no, and it was also he realized that his action wasn't acceptable by that group either, right? So that lie is like acknowledgement of that what he did was not acceptable and was not right either. And so I just think that's like really, yeah, it was a really sort of whole interesting dynamic. I also think the fact that that guy was like wearing a suit and was sort of like this snobby, like yuppie sort of character in this zombie apocalypse. There's a shooting match going outside. They're drinking like moonshine. So there's like that parallel of like these different people, right? And like I just thought that that whole scene was like really interesting. And then when you have those like stray like magic bullets kind of flying around that are hitting multiple people, like everyone's reacting to that like in this very like passive still way, and Warren doesn't even like really acknowledge the danger when the bartender turns into a zombie, and instead just sort of like pins him down like you said and has that heart to heart with him. And I think that that's like, it's really interesting the way they played all those actions together, because it's no different than on a real team where what you do affects that whole team overall, and people can always react to it differently, but everyone still stayed focused, right? Warren was getting herself in the right mental state. 10K was still trying to win that shooting match, and Murphy was still just trying to beat Murphy and survive.
He accepted the mission too, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm the mission. I got to do whatever it takes. So I thought 10K also demonstrated a really good team member and leader quality in this episode when he did win the shootout, got that big rifle, but also accepted that the other person who was firing was better than him and should have won. And then giving that to the other person, essentially leaving himself and his team with nothing. But what's interesting about that is that it's like sometimes doing the right thing as a leader sucks.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like it's helping anybody. And we can get into this mindset of like the means justify the ends, or the ends justify the means. And so, but when we get caught in that, we can become very toxic. So he acknowledged in that moment that it was like, this person actually deserved this and I didn't. So it's that giving credit, giving that recognition, but also accepting like this is the right thing to do, even though it does not look like a good thing for us as a team.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because I was also thinking, like, I looked at it too as like he did what was right, and then it worked out for him in the end because there was that zombie that was coming up, and she was able to use that new rifle to kind of save him. So it's kind of like that whole you put that good stuff out there, and you kind of get good stuff back. And I think that can become very important, because you can kind of get lost in that ends justifying the means, and sometimes be like, well, we'll maybe not do it the best way this time, but that's just because we're so far behind. We won't put the best stuff out there, but that'll let us get caught up. And we all know, or if you don't, you'll realize it, that compounds, right? That issue compounds, because then you maybe don't put the best thing out there. People are going to come back, ask for changes, and you've doubled your workload, right? Versus just sort of stopping and doing it the right way that you're supposed to do it. So I think there's a lot of really great points that come out of all of that.
Agreed.
But so something else that I thought was interesting. So you have that, I forget, because they call them different things at different times, but that like zombie storm,
Zunami.
Yes, you have the Zunami coming, and so now you have Citizen Z, who's like aware of this, needs to try to get a hold of everyone. Everyone's sort of in their own little thing, and I think that's interesting too, because since he is that remote team member, and ever since you brought that up in like an earlier episode, I'm telling you, it's just been a real mind blower for me. Is he's away from that group. He has no danger, right, coming to him from this thing. He's on a different continent, right? Like it is so far away from his issue, but like the amount of like fear that he has for the team and wants to reach out to them about this is like, that's like this weird level of like anxiety that I totally get too, because I think sometimes as leaders, you may know things that are coming or going to happen or things like that. And it's like you sometimes you get put in that position of like, I tend to just not overshare, but I like to let the team know everything. Sometimes you can't always do that. And you don't always know like how they're going to respond to a roadblock or something like that. And so like that anxiety of like anticipation of building up to it, I think was like, I could definitely relate to that. This big thing is coming, you want to try to tell the team, but you can't get a hold of them. And so it's like, oh gosh, they're left to react on their own. And that's like, you have trust and faith and believe that, they're going to be able to make the right decision. But like, it's also like very anxiety inducing because you're putting someone in a spot that's going to be stressful for them, or about a stressful spot coming up. And you don't get that chance to give them that heads up.
Yes. And I think that, yeah, there's a lot of things highlighted there, just like as like the remote team member, that he believes in this mission, right? So he is all in. And because of that, and because he has started to make these connection points with the different people on the team, there's this level of care that does lead to that anxiety of not only are they okay, but like, is this mission going to continue to move forward, like you said? So yeah, it's interesting just that, again, he was on board. He was one of the initial communicators of what the mission was. But at the same time, he obviously believes in it, because he could technically get off all comms and not do anything, right? But instead, it's like he's being a really good team member, still jumping in, still making sure that they have the data that they need to actually complete the mission.
It's such a great point, because I mean, he was involved with that mission even before Warren was, but like, I think it's a lot of maturity and like forethought from him to like, he provides information, right? He supports the team how he can, but he's not like in charge of that mission, but like he has been there since the very beginning. He's been there before Warren or anyone else even knew about the mission. So I think I think it's a really interesting point too.
Yeah. So we'll take this into the next episode, because the next episode was the Zunami episode. And yes, so Addie and Mac, they went ahead to do some recon, kind of find some other resources. They're now separated from the group. They can't go back because of this Zunami. And then so now the team that is still all together, Warren is stepping back into being in the zone of leadership. And yeah, so now they find that it starts off with them in the little town. They're all like super dehydrated. They need water. And Murphy's fine for whatever reason. He's doing great, jumping around. And then they have to take shelter when they see this huge Zunami coming. So yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in this episode too. So what were some of your initial thoughts?
I thought from Citizen Z, I thought like the fact that some of that like remoteness, right? Some of those cracks were starting to form a little bit, or starting to expose themselves a little bit more. It was a hard time for everyone, right? Like you had said, with the rest of the team being so dehydrated, with that Zunami coming, like it was kind of like definitely a give up point. Or let me start over. It could have become like a give up point, right? Like that's it. We tried as hard as we could. And so like that perseverance that was coming from Murphy, I thought that was like really, really interesting, right? Because again, we talked about him not always being the best contributor of the team, but was really the one who was able to rally everyone up and get them to move into that mortuary, I think it was, which, again, terrible place to go in a zombie apocalypse, but not my call. It wasn't there.
And then they do meet the other person. I don't remember his name, but the other person who was there, he shares some of his like homemade drink with them, right? Which doesn't really hydrate them, but it was interesting because it's like this new team member, this new person who just by virtue of them all needing to hide and do the same thing becomes a de facto member of the team, and shows a a show of good faith by sharing something that he had that he absolutely did not have to share. But I think so. This is also where Murphy, again, he's like coming more into the fold as a teammate when they realize that the zombies are about to come into that building, and he goes looking for an additional place to hide. So, and that's when they find the actual morgue and like decide to move into that space. But then I think Murphy also does something else when they realize the zombies are also going to be getting in there. He knows they're not going to hurt him, right? So he's slightly less concerned. So at this point, he could do nothing, technically, right? And he'd still be supporting the mission and all of that. But when they start to put the people in like the mortuary boxes, I don't know what they're called, but the mortuary boxes, and then they realize there's no space left for Warren. In that moment, I think Murphy does the first active problem solving that he does for the team. And that's when he goes looking for something else, and he finds that body bag for Warren to get into. Up till then, it was kind of like things where if he participated, it was kind of happenstance or he could jump in. But I felt like that was him actively problem solving to be like, I can be part of this solution. Like I can keep people safe and like, let me go find a way to do that versus just like kind of something else. Even though he had no horse in that race, technically, he would have been fine.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I didn't look at it like from him problem solving, right? And I think that's a really, really valid point, because I had just seen it as being he had nothing else better to do. But again, I think it's also the lens, like we talked about with the show and everything, trying to look at it from a leadership thing. You can look through it as like through a different lens. And I always just see Murphy as like the problem child, right? Like he's the guy that's always impossible to get the buy-in and get going on the mission. So I guess even in my own right, I approach him as a person through a bad lens, right? Like need to restructure that as well. So, because I think that's one of the things you run into. You want to try to like remember and know and go off of past experience, but at the same time, you want to try to give somebody a fresh start, as often as possible, and go into it with a new day as being a new day. So yeah, I guess I didn't really look at the problem solving piece. I also thought it was weird though. So you had the kind of the new teammate guy, that younger guy, gets a little panicky, and he's trying to like he ends up trying to like break out of the whatever those things are called, the where he was hiding, right, getting out of his hiding spot. And you had Doc trying to like talk him down a little bit and like keep him calm, but he ended up making that own decision, and sort of it didn't end well for him. And so I think that's really interesting too, is like that the team, Doc did everything he could without sacrificing himself for the rest of the team for this like sort of outside entity. And I thought that showed a lot of restraint, right? That it wasn't like he was going to also now bust out just because this random guy came in and said, we're going to do this. Like, I think this is the right call. And Doc's like, nah, probably not, man. But, that guy went with it anyway. So I think that, you can't just plug somebody in and then think that they're going to lead the group because nobody followed,
Right. And Warren was back in her like leadership role there.
Yeah.
And kind of like what you were saying about Murphy too, I feel like there could be a whole series that's just like the dichotomy of Murphy. So when he does this problem solving thing, the zombies come in, he stands over Warren, he knows the zombies aren't going to touch him, but it was almost like this additional safety of like bypass her. Yeah. But then we fast forward a little bit, he actively steals food and water from a living family.
Right.
So it's this whole like, who is this guy? Like he is wildly toxic in so many ways. And then in other ways, you're like, is he coming around? Like, what does this look like for him? And we could like dive into his background. We don't necessarily want to get into the psychology of it. It feels like a whole other series, but it's like, I mean, he, came from being in the prison system. Probably whatever happened to him prior to that wasn't great. Right. So it's like, and now he's being treated like a prisoner and not like a person. So he's having these moments of great care and great humanity. And then these other moments where you're like, we were so close. We were so close.
Not only does he steal the food, right, but then he opens the door to let the zombie like dad in, which is going to be emotionally traumatizing to those people. if they actually survive it, but like also I don't think they're going to survive it. So he was also covering his tracks to ensure that finding of the food or that lie was like always there, right? So he just made himself look like this great guy, and it's like, oh my goodness gracious, right? So
Right.
that was crazy. And what's what's also interesting is in that lie, everyone's been semi wary of him, right? So so now on that team within that dynamic, he's he's made them question their own belief structure, even though what you and I know as the viewer is that is still a sound assessment of his character, right? Of not being someone who's super trustworthy, but he's made them question themselves, and that's like that really sucks, right? Because you're messing with their psychological safety in a way, and that's like, I think that's something as leaders, bad leaders can sometimes do to their teams, of like that whole like, you know being like really mean or something like that, and then be like, oh, sorry, have an extra hour of time off or something. You know what I mean? Like you can really start to just mess with people, or they're mean to one person for doing something, and then the other person can do it, and it's no big deal, and it's always like, oh, it's because they did this, that, or the other. It's like, no, it's kind of, everyone's equal in this. So yeah, it's just a weird thing.
It's gaslighting, right? So it's like,
That's the
we
word.
can't trust him. Not really, because then he comes back and Warren's like, oh, you came back. And he's like, I told you could trust me after you just stole from this family. So it is really interesting, because that is a like, don't even like worry about that. Just like look at like what I can show you, that confirmation bias that points to what I'm trying to prove, and anything else, you're crazy for looking at that or thinking about that, or that was an like one-off type of situation. So yeah, it's super, it's super interesting, and especially to watch his version of evolving as a team member is just it's super interesting. But what I appreciate about it is, I know it's a TV show, but it also feels really honest with people, with a person who maybe didn't have great role models and parents. I'm painting with a very broad brush right now, but like maybe who didn't have great role models and parents, maybe got caught up in things in their teenage and college years, where then kind of put them on a path of crime and stuff like that it's like there weren't these people in their way to stop those things from happening, or the people who were in their way weren't strong enough or firm enough or forceful enough to help shift that path in any way. So what kind of a person is created from that, and can you actually undo all of that trauma? That's not a leader's job, by the way. It's not a leader's job to be like, start with your birth, tell me every traumatic thing, we'll make a chart, we'll work through it one by one. Not their job. But it's just so interesting sometimes when you're like, I have this team member, and it seems like no matter what I do, like they're not on board. So we can point to systems, be like, the hiring system is not right because you have to hire the right person and blah, blah, blah. But it's like, at the end of the day, though, like sometimes people get through and it's like, how do I fix this? Because as leaders, we're fixers, we're problem solvers. Some things are not fixable, especially by you. A catalyst has to happen for this person, and you're not the person who's going to put that catalyst in their way.
Yeah. That was a lot.
It was.
You blew my mind. I'm gonna take us way back for a minute.
Okay, yeah.
You had said confirmation bias, and what I thought was interesting was like the leadership blinders. And when you look at this point what Citizen Z is going through, right? We know that there is a carbon monoxide buildup that's happening in his little bunker thing, right? But he is so focused on the Zunami, he's so focused on the safety of the team and everything else, that he manifests that Russian cosmonaut, and he's playing video games with him and driving him around and all that kind of thing. And like, but he's so focused originally on like that there's the beep alarm of the carbon monoxide detector, and he's ignoring it and is like, you're it was like, you're messing with my concentration or whatever. So he like was trying to destroy that alarm. And I was like, I think that sometimes, too, I thought there was a really great point as leaders, you can get so focused on the mission that you don't always notice when your team is struggling, because you're like, just get through it, just get through it. And instead of stopping, reassessing, ensuring the health of the team, ensuring the health of the workplace, and then moving forward. So I thought that was really interesting. Um, and then again, even that manifestation of that cosmonaut and kind of that idea of like, Russia's the enemy, but we're, making them the friend a little bit. Like it was almost like even subconsciously, and then he got very wary and was like, thought he was trying to, steal his resources or whatever. I just thought that like, it was a really interesting sort of way of painting that picture. But you can definitely get hung up on the issue and forget the bigger picture very quickly. You know what I mean? Get that tunnel vision.
Absolutely. And I really like what you said there about what are our team members struggling with, and am I aware of that? And I think it also, like, if we're going back to just calling our Citizen Z our remote team member, if he doesn't tell you, you don't know. And
Yeah.
so there are different ways that leaders need to stay connected in those times where it's like, yeah, let me assess, like maybe they're not trying to reach out, or maybe they're not as productive or whatever. But yeah, do I have at least my finger on the pulse of what good and normal looks like for this remote team member?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But this episode, like I said, there was a lot of like really like interesting, uh, little things that sort of took place there. And then I think that through Murphy's sort of very like, because I also think he was gonna just leave. He wasn't gonna go back for the team at all. You know what I mean? And he had his food, he had his supplies. He's sort of that he stole from that innocent family. Not to beat a dead horse, but they were innocent. Um, that he goes back for them. I think that's it's also kind of a weird sort of like power play in a way, because
Mm.
he could have left them there to die, and now they knew that too. So I think that was just sort of very strange. I thought there was a really strange sort of like, and then they all look at him as a hero. It's just weird, if they only knew everything else that was happening.
But that's like a great point too, right? Is that like we don't always know the whole story. And so there's a certain amount of trust that we have to have with our team members that they're giving us as holistic of a perspective as possible. And so I feel like that's what the team did there, was they went in and they leaned into this trust that he came back for them because he cared and he brought resources with him, right? So better to lean into that probably sometimes. Like sometimes we just have to be, we don't want to be blindly optimistic and out of touch with reality, but at the same time, trusting that someone maybe has good intentions. Because if you just question everybody's intentions all the time, you're never going to have a good team. You're never going to have a good working relationship. So that's a good point that you brought up there, because it's like there are times when you just have to, I trust that this is the right thing, right? I'm sure my boss has to do that when I come to her with these crazy ideas about programs, and I'm like, we're going to do this huge thing. And she's just like, do it, right? Like, get it going. Like, let's see how this, let's move forward with it. And she'll, ask questions around like sense making and, making sure we have audience and stakeholders and all of that clear. But it's never like, why should we do this? Like, what does this even matter? And like, why do you want to do this? Right. Because then it would make a very weird relationship for us. So, yeah.
That's a really good point. So yeah, it really does relies on that leader being kind of having that awareness enough to know when those right opportunities are.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it was a good episode. It went there. For what it was a very good episode, especially when we're talking about the kind of team development and team dynamics, of where that went. And I also thought, as we're wrapping up here, that I also think it was very like self-sacrificing. Warren took like one of the least secure positions as well, right? She made all the team were in those lockers and wasn't counting, right? It's a very simple math problem to do, and never even did that. Was just like, you're going in, you're going in, you're going in, and then reassess. There was nowhere for her to go. But that was, the afterthought. She was worried about the team first. I thought that was pretty interesting,
Yes.
or noble rather.
And just, yeah, going from when Garnett passed into her needing that time to figure out her stuff, and just how I think it's just a true show of leadership too, where it's like she was able to re-grab those reins and be like, yep, and now we're going to keep moving forward and I can lead this team. So yeah, I thought it was a great show of leadership as well.
Definitely.
Awesome.